Art teachers of Reddit. What's the most disturbing artwork a student has submitted? Story 1. When I was in high school. In his house, they found a rifle the drawings of the school. He was planning on setting a fire in the chemistry lab. And when people came out of the other side of the building, he would be sitting in the bleachers of the football field with a rifle. I don't know what happened after he got arrested, but hopefully he's never effing getting out of prison. This guy is seriously dangerous. Also, our teachers and school administration were clearly effing brain dead. Ho, starting off hot, okay. Story 2. Not an art teacher, but reminds me of an art project me and my buddy did when we were 14. At the time, art was compulsory, despite the fact that both of us hated it and neither of us had any talent. So for the project, you had to find a local artist whose work you enjoyed or found interesting, interview them, and talk about their methods and all that sort of crap. Us being teenage smart butts decided to completely wing it, whilst also trying to have a laugh with it. My buddy's dad posed as the artist, who we named Juan Smith, and his specialty was tiling or something. Our project consisted of us taking photographs of my friend's dad, looking somewhat confused and irritated beside the tiling in his bathroom, and writing a few paragraphs about how and why we enjoyed his work. All in all, I think our project came to about 3 pages. Nevertheless, we had finished and didn't give a crap about quality or quantity for that matter. We were worried about getting caught and put in the weekend detention, so we hatched a plan to cover our tracks. On the last page of our project, we made an obituary claiming that Juan had been caught up in the tsunami in Japan, and nobody had heard from him since. Great, we thought at the time. The teacher won't be able to track him down or complain to us that she couldn't get in contact with him to confirm we had actually done the work, and not just completely bullcrap it like we did. Don't ask me what we were thinking. Anyway, time comes for submission, and we hand it in feeling somehow in the clear. Our teacher flicks through our work, and her face just turns to this look of utter disgust and frustration. She shakes her head and refuses to even grade the thing. All we got was a "see me after class," underlined about 10 times for dramatic effect. She ended up having to leave the class early, so we didn't have to stay behind to be reprimanded, and because it was near the end of the year, we just never went back. I never saw her again, but I'm sure she always thought what a pair of a-holes we were. Not just for the crap we came out with, but also because we genuinely thought it was going to fly, and we were so smug about it. Haven't spoken to that friend in about 6 years now, but every time I think about that, I can't help but smile. The image of his dad crouching beside some random Thailand looking into the forlorn with the caption, "Our hearts go out to Juan, to be an effing teenager again, man." Story 3. Back in the 90s, I volunteered at an art studio that provided free classes for low-income inner-city, at-risk youth. Wonderful nonprofit run by a couple of cool old hippie ladies who did an amazing job helping the kids feel free to express themselves artistically no matter what they wanted to create. For example, one teenage smart butt made an elaborate papier-mâché of Bob Marley smoke in a huge joint, and they hung it proudly in a place of honor. No judgment or preachiness at that art class. So one year they decided to have the younger kids do a Day of the Dead themed picture with a short paragraph to commemorate a loved one. The teachers were expecting a picture of grandma, or maybe pets, and there were some of those. There were also several scenes of murder, including childishly drawn guns, knives, and oh, so much red, followed by short descriptions like "My brother got shot, he's dead now." It was loud and scary, and I miss him. These were like 7-year-olds. Those pictures were displayed just as proudly as the grandma pics. Story 4. Not an art teacher, but I went to middle school with this kid we'll call Evan. Evan was always a little weird and had a violent disposition. For example, besides him being involved in numerous fights in Spanish, we were given a writing prompt about a man being summoned to visit the king. In most kids' stories, he was a hero, killed a dragon, etc. Nope, Evan's character was a mass murderer sentenced to death who escaped and killed a few guards before being killed himself. Anyway, we're in some elective class and we had to design and print a cereal box. We're like 12, so of course it's Skater O's or Soccer Pops or NSYNC Flakes. It's early 2000s, by the way. But not Evan. No, his imagination was not bound to such childish ideas. He proudly presented Cannibal O's, which featured on the front panel of the box a cannibal eating a bowl of full body parts. I wish I could, for the life of me, remember what the made-up nutrition facts he put on the side were. Besides disturbing, but the image of the front of his box will forever be burned into my brain. I used to look his name up occasionally, wondering where the inevitable shooting spree had taken place. But his current Facebook picture makes it look like he just became a pretty typical emo kid, even if that's a bit strange now closing in on 30 years old. Story 5. Not me, but I played a huge part. Brother's art class in second grade was doing those full body tracings on big sheets of butcher paper. They were supposed to trace each other and then draw themselves. My brother evidently refused to draw a face for himself, would not budge on that, drew everything else but no face. Wouldn't say why, and because he was super shy and quiet, clammed up more when the teacher started grilling him about it. Art teacher calls principal because this is concerning. Principal calls school counselor. Counselor meets with my brother, who still won't talk about why he won't draw his face, asking him questions like, do you not like yourself? Do you feel bad about yourself? Etc. At this point, he's really clammed up and is now refusing to talk because he's really shy to begin with. And all this questioning is making it worse. School calls my parents. They have a meeting about the fact that they think my brother is depressed or has some kind of mental issue. Parents freak, of course, and brother still won't talk. Parents and counselors start asking if he feels neglected or unloved or some sort of crap. Mom's crying dad is frustrated, and brother thinks he's in trouble for something. And I guess in an effort to stop them all acting crazy, he says he doesn't draw his face because he hates someone in the family. Cue full family counseling. For a month, mom is a wreck and thinks my brother feels like they neglect him and don't love him. So she's just constantly like, I love you very much, right? Counseling isn't going well because brother is just quiet and confused. Me, 2 years older than him, is just mad we have to be at this office in the first place. Finally, during one session, brother finally cracks. Doctor asks, who is the person in your family? You said you hated brother, says our cat. She bites me. My mom and dad are stone-faced. Doctor is surprised but pushes his advantage now that brother is finally talking. Why didn't you want to draw your face? Do you feel bad about yourself? I wanted Angsty to do it. She's a better drawer than me. No psychosis, no early childhood trauma, no mental disorder, just an overly concerned art teacher and a little kid who thought it would be best if his older sister drew his face because she was a better drawer. Story 6. I have an art studio for children and have seen some very interesting artwork produced throughout the years. The 2 experiences I am listing below didn't involve the children's artwork, but they were disturbing all the same. I had a little boy 5 years old who always wore gloves and sunglasses. I knew he needed to wear them due to some sensory issues he was experiencing. Although he did get defensive when the other kids asked him about his outfit, he was a sweet kid. One day during summer camp, I saw him sitting on the floor, whispering intently into an air vent in German. I had no idea he could speak German. He had only spoken English for the time I knew him. I asked him what he was doing, who he was talking to, and he explained, I'm communicating with the demons. When I talked to his mom about it later, she told me he doesn't know how to speak German. For a while, I rented out the basement area of a school for my art studio. I had a little boy who pointed to our supply closet and stated, "You're going to die in there someday." Edit, I myself do not speak German. I assume that he was speaking German. My mother can speak German, and that's what it sounded like. The teaching assistant I had with me at the time also said it sounded exactly like German. I don't know what he was saying. Sorry, folks. Edit 2. When I spoke to his mother, I told her it sounded like German to me, but I couldn't be sure. I think we're a bit too worried about the German. I don't care whether he was speaking it or not, or what language he was speaking. The kid's speaking into the air vent and told you he's communicating with demons. And then another kid looks at you dead in the eyes and said, "You're gonna die." Oh, I don't care if it was German or not. Let's worry about the English words they're using. I would quit. Story 7. In middle school, I wrote a poem called The Boy That Was Too Small. I thought it was super artsy and full of teen angst. I was going to submit it for a writing award. I was so proud. My parents said they got a call from my teacher and they needed to go talk about my poem. I was so happy. I thought for sure I was getting an award. They get back from the meeting and sit down with me, kind of annoyed, and start asking me questions about the poem and about how I feel in general. I was very confused, and my dad finally blurted out, "Why would you write such a depressing poem? If you are sad, you know you can talk to us," which made me more confused. They pointed out a few parts of the poem where I wrote that the boy was sad, and was on a tall building, to which I responded, "Did you read the whole thing?" The last stanza is about how he's happy with the way life is. I'm totally fine and not going to unalive myself, guys. My parents said okay and left the room. My teacher, who freaked out about the poem, gave me a B. I didn't win any awards. Story 8. Not an art teacher, but was a weird kid and drew a weird picture. I remember it pretty vividly for being so young. 3 or 4, I drew a picture of a guy with his pants down peeing and a girl in a skirt with a look of disgust on her face. I showed my mom, and at the time had no idea why she was freaking out or why she wasn't telling me she loved it, like all my other drawings. It wasn't until writing this just now that I made this connection. I think I drew this as a little kid because at the age above, my mom would take myself and my brother to a lady named Pat's house. Pat was an oldest lady that watched a bunch of kids during the day. One memory I have of that place is a bunch of us kids napping on mats on the floor in a dark room. I was laying there awake. That Pat lady held a pantsless little boy over me, genitals in my face and all. It was only a few seconds, but sadly I don't remember anything else about it, or why the F she did it. Edit. To everyone who thinks and or would like to bet money that she was just lifting him up over me because he was laying next to me, he wasn't. He was crying or something from across the room. It's all fuzzy, but trust me, this memory bothers me a little, and I've thoroughly thought it over. There was really no reason for her to do that. Story 9. Not the teacher, I was the kid. Little background. Grew up in a small beach town and was somewhat known for my artwork and being a pretty good artist for a little kid. 8th grade, we had to design a deck of playing cards. I was 13 and going through a really hard time and made this series of super dark cards, like the Fallen King and the Dead Joker, Queen of Human Hearts, Hanged King, etc. I really enjoyed working on them and loved how they turned out. Very dark, but also colorful, like Dolly meets Tim Burton. Anyway, I went to a small private school, and our cards were going to be on display for this art show. Mine weren't allowed in the show, and weren't allowed to be displayed for being too dark, and my teacher said I need therapy, which surprise I was already in, and was told to express my negative feelings through my art, which I did, and then got in trouble for it and denied a place in an art show. I still have the cards. I still think they're dope. Still bitter about not being allowed in the art show. Story 10. I finally made a very realistic female anatomy in my pottery class. This happened to me during one of my ceramics class in college. The professor was teaching us how to use the pottery wheel to make bowls. If you can imagine the act of throwing a bowl out of clay, the clay is pulled up taller and wider as the pottery wheel spins. So I'm doing my thing, making a real nice bowl. Then at a certain point, it all collapsed inwards from 2 opposite sides, the clay folding in on itself as it fell, and the weight causing the original bowl shape to elongate. I was left with what looked like a perfectly detailed clay female body part. So naturally, I left it as it was and fired it, glazed it. Now, years later, I sneak it into friends' houses and put it on their bookshelves. When they find it, they shake their heads, laugh, and do the same thing to someone else in the friend cycle. I call it the Brotherhood of the Traveling Bag. Story 11, not an art teacher, but this one time in 8th grade art class, our teacher told us to draw a realistic-looking ice cream cone. Me being the different kid that I was in middle school, I drew the cone blue, not the ice cream. The cone holding the ice cream was blue. Teacher comes up to me to take a gander. She's not pleased. "What are you doing?" I said, "Realistic." There is no such thing as blue ice cream cones. Automatic failure. And I'm sitting there thinking in my head, what the F? How have you never seen those multicolored ice cream cones they sell at the grocery store? But whatever. Fast forward to later on in the day, I go with my mom to a trip to the grocery store. By this point, I had told her about the incident, and she was livid. We make our way down the ice cream mile, and there in all their blue glory was a box of blue ice cream cones. My mom gets a devilish smirk on her face and says to me, "Should I buy these and have you take them to your teacher tomorrow?" And I instantly say yes, and could barely sleep that night, holding in my excitement to make my teacher eat crow the next day. It's the next day, and I'm so hyped all day, waiting for this moment to make this teacher just look like an a-hole in front of everyone. 4th period arrives, I walk in. "Hey, Ms. Fake Name, I brought you a present." "Seriously," she says in glee. "Yes." I say I unzip my backpack and throw the box of cones on her desk and go blue cones and walk back to my desk like an effing boss. Her jaw dropped. She pulled me aside after class and ended up giving me full credit on the assignment and apologized for how rude she was. Victory was won that day. Another fun story. I work in a grocery store now, and she, of all people, came in. I look way different now. I'm a freshman in college with facial hair, so there's no way in heck that she remembers me. I walk over to her while I'm sweeping the store and say, "Hey, just in case you were wondering, blue cones are on the aisle 10. Her face instantly turned red and said, "Well, I'm never going to be able to escape you." And then she did an awkward laugh, and we both went on our merry way. Story 12. It was an amazing dragon. The kid was 5 years old. I had never seen such talent at that age. Serious protege level art. I work as an English teacher in Japan, and it was during a trial lesson. Kids or nervous mothers are in the room watching, and I am doing my thing. I had the kids that would finish their writing early, turn over the paper, and draw anything they want on the back while they waited for others to finish. At that age, you need to keep them doing something at all times. I remember just staring at the picture. It was so good, but I had to shake it off and focus. Speaking practice time, I went around the circle asking questions. The little artist was so nervous that when it came his time to speak, he threw up all over himself and the floor. As a teacher, I have seen and dealt with my share of liquids, so it was no problem for me. In my kindest voice possible, I start to comfort the child, telling him, "It's no problem. Don't worry. We can just whack." The mother has jumped out of her chair and starts slapping the boy about the head so hard he falls into his vomit and throws up again. Whack and scream. Throw up. Whack and scream. For the next 10 seconds, the other mothers and I are horrified to watch a mother beating on her sick child. I jumped to his defense, begging the mother to stop. She grabbed his arm and dragged him from the room and from my school. The most disturbing artwork was a beautiful picture drawn by a gifted but abused child. Story 13. Not an art teacher, but several years ago I taught preschoolers, so there was a lot of art involved. My second year teaching a little girl who had recently turned 5, drew a very disturbing picture there during free play. There was a small person lying horizontally with what looked like tears falling from her eyes. A larger person standing close behind. That alone okay, but the thing that pushed it into a much darker territory was the fact that the larger person had what was definitely meant to be a chicken very close to the smaller figure's genital area. It took me a minute to register what I was seeing. Anyone who has seen a 5-year-old draw knows that it is far from perfect and usually lacking much detail. When I asked the girl if she could tell me about her picture, she just calmly said that was her and her mommy's boyfriend. As with any incident involving child abuse, the proper authorities were called, and after the poor baby was put through examinations and spoke to counselors, it finally came out that her mother's new boyfriend had been abusing her for about a month since they had been living together. From that moment on, I paid much more attention to the pictures children drew and the explanations that went along with them. Sometimes that's the only way they know to tell their story. Story 14, Seth. When I was a little kid, I kind of had this problem, and it's not even that big of a deal. Something like 8% of kids do it. For some reason, I don't know why I would just kind of sit around all day and draw pictures of chickens. Evan, what draw pictures of chickens? Chickens like a man chicken. Yes, like a man chicken. I'd just sit there hours on end drawing chickens. I didn't know what it was. I couldn't touch the pen to the paper without drawing the shape of a chicken. That's effed up, Seth. No crap, it's really effed up. Here I am, a little kid, and I can't stop drawing chickens to save my own life. All right, I just don't see what this has to do with Becca. Just listen. Okay, your precious little Becca sat next to me for all of 4th grade, and in the classroom was where I did the majority of my illustrations. I was very secretive about the whole chicken operation. Even I thought I was effing crazy. Imagine what everyone else would think. So I would stash all my chicken drawings in this Ghostbusters lunchbox that I had. So one day I'm finishing up this real big veiny triumphant thing. All of a sudden, you hit Becca's foot with your chicken. Yeah, I know. She starts crying, she flips out, then she rats me out to the principal. He finds the Ghostbusters lunchbox chicken treasure chest, and he effing flips out. He calls in my parents. Turns out this principal is a religious fanatic, and he thinks I'm possessed by some sort of chicken devil. My parents go make me see some therapist, and he's asking me all these chicken questions. They literally stopped me from eating foods that were shaped like chicken. No hot dogs, no popsicles. You know how many foods are shaped like chickens? The best kinds. Well, I don't. That's really messed up and super weird. I will never forget that picture. Story 15. Obligatory, not an art teacher, but when I was in high school, I had some real issues with my grades. From not doing my homework, mostly due to depression and anxiety issues, as well as boredom, as my classes were all far too easy for me, and I had to go at the pace of the lowest common denominator in each class. But anyway, it resulted in my guidance counselor deciding I needed to take the easiest possible English class when signing up for my classes at the beginning of the year. She took me out of the literature class I was really excited about and put me in a remedial English class, even though English was my favorite subject. And I was highly advanced in it, had already had poetry published, etc. Because obviously, if I'm bored with things being too easy, the answer is to put me in an even easier class. But I digress. In this remedial English class, we each got a word, and we had to go in front of the classroom and draw the definition of the word for the class on the marker board. So for example, if someone got the word happy, they might draw a smiling face or something. My word was acrid, and the first thing I thought was burning hair is definitely an acrid smell. So I went up front and drew a stick person screaming with their arms waving, with their head on fire, sent right to the guidance counselor because I was apparently disturbed. Then a few months later, we had to draw a scene from a book. I asked if I could draw the end of my favorite musical that was based on a book and mix the endings a bit or take creative liberties, and the teacher said I could. So I drew the ending of The Phantom of the Opera as he's being hung by the Phantom's magical Punjab lasso, while Christine kissed the Phantom to save Raoul. Raoul being hung by the Phantom's magical Punjab lasso, while Christine kissed the Phantom to save Raoul. Bam, back to the counselor because I drew someone committing self-unaliving. I explained the magic lasso, etc., and was told I was wrong. The next day, I brought my copy of the original Gaston Leroux novel with the pages mentioning the lasso marked, and a printout of the Wikipedia page describing it and its use. No apology from anyone involved for calling me a liar. I hated that stupid school. Ended up dropping out and going to a charter school instead. Got to do the exact same classes at my own pace with minimal intrusion from anyone else. Graduated in 3 months with straight A's. Story 16. I used to run after school daycare centers for the YMCA. I had this one kindergartner who I am fairly certain was in the beginning stages of schizophrenia. He had a basically normal older brother in my program too, and good parents. One day, we had planned finger painting. We set up easels, got the kids in smocks, laid out Dixie cups with tempura, painted them, and let them go into town. We didn't give the kids any direction on what to paint, told them what to use and how to use their imaginations. Most kids painted a house with their family, a sun in the sky, a dog in the yard. But this kid, whom I will call Joe, painted something completely different. He started by painting a disturbingly perfect outer circle about 18 inches in diameter. I didn't really pay attention to what he was painting until the end. I did notice from behind his easel that he was being very deliberative in his painting. I'd never seen him concentrate so much. When it was time to wrap up, I went by each kid's painting, one by one, asked them what they had painted, and praised them individually. Wow, that's an awesome picture of your family, Kelsey. When I got to Joe's painting, here's what I saw. A perfect circle. The circle was completely filled with blacks, with very deep browns, and incredibly deep blues. It was just chaos. There were no large strokes. He had basically dabbed every single part of the painting carefully with his fingertip. It was completely random, yet at the same time completely deliberate. It was almost a pointless painting because from a distance it was just a deep black circle. But up close it was a riot of blacks and blues and browns and other deep shades. I honestly did not know what to say. The gosh dang thing just looked evil, I guess. Finally, I asked Joe what it was he painted. This is God. Man, that gave me the effing shivers. This was around 1987, so he's about 35 or so now. And I'm assuming he's in prison somewhere. Story 17. Well, I'll be honest here. I got in trouble in art class for an honest mistake. I'd say it was about second grade. My dad is a World War II history buff, and I grew up watching all these shows, movies, and documentaries about World War II. I began to find the history of the war very fascinating, like my dad. However, being that young, I didn't fully understand everything. And I didn't understand what the swastika was, I swear. At that age, I assumed it was just the German flag. So in art class, one day we had to draw flags of countries. And guess what? I drew a swastika. I assumed it was the flag for Germany. No one noticed until I started walking out the school after class one day with it, and all these parents saw it. And that was the day I learned what that really meant. I swear it was an honest mistake. Moral of the story is kids don't know better sometimes with what they are drawing, and it is what they are exposed to that they draw. Story 18. I was a fairly good artist at a very young age. Not a brag part of the story. In third grade, I drew a ninja that looked a lot like Storm Shadow firing off arrows towards an off-page adversary. The ninja himself was riddled with arrows, including one through the groin. The only colored pencil I had was red, so naturally there was a lot of blood, and it stood out against the monochrome of the drawing. I went to a small private school, and when the uptight teacher saw it, she literally gasped, grabbed the paper, and ran to the principal's office. I got reprimanded, my parents were contacted, and I had a day of detention. The drawing wasn't even that bad. The point of the story, the teacher's reaction was so strong, I felt I'd done something terribly wrong. So I pretty much stopped drawing. I didn't pick it back up until almost 20 years later. Story 19. Hello, art teacher here. It's not so much the drawing as what was implied. I once had a student, a little one. I mainly work with preschoolers, who drew a picture of her family. Her father was very tall compared to anyone else in her drawings, and she had drawn him with green and purple crayons. She drew the upper part of his pants as red. She had drawn herself as very small compared to her family, and had drawn a small red circle around her genital area that was the same color as her dad's pants. Everyone in the picture was colored normally except for her dad and herself. I became extremely suspicious. Little kids drawing family members much taller than them, or making themselves very small in pictures, generally shows the power dynamic in the family. Too tall and the power play can be abusive at home. Kids also use green and purple colors when drawing something that makes them feel bad, as they are rotten type colors. Blue is usually used as happy instead of sad. Actually, you'll get a lot of kids who will draw purple tears or green tears for crying sad people instead of blue tears. Yellow can be added with greens and purples, and a lot of times that signifies not happiness, but feeling lonely. Yellow can be seen as an indifferent color. Some kids use it to indicate happiness, some indicate it for more difficult emotions. It's kind of a toss-up. Red is almost always happiness. Remember, I'm talking about a 2 to 6 age range, where depicting violence is not common at all and would actually signify something serious. But if added in certain areas of a person's head, eyes, or groin, that is a very big red flag. Obvious things like red pants aren't a big deal, but drawing red in a specific area can mean this hurts here. So I was very worried she was drawing out essay and feeling very yucky about her father. I sent in a report, and it was taken. I did take a photo for evidence, but this was years ago, and I have no clue where the photo is. The child was pulled from my class in the following weeks, and I was never told what had happened, and I think of that little girl often. Story 20. I was dating a gal whose teenage son was a wonderful artist. He had just moved schools because he was constantly in trouble for petty stuff. Hair touches collar pants have a slight worn spot that might rip. Really petty. The school technically couldn't punish him other than calling my gal all the time. The art teacher, of course, loved him and helped him out quite a bit. The disturbing art was this. The students were tasked with doing a page like a comic book. Panels on a page with no words that should tell a story. He actually already had done it at home for fun. He took a book he read and turned it into a comic. He had like Frank Miller's Sin City style, black and white in just one color. He chose red. And obviously this is where the trouble began. He turned in the assignment early, taking just one action page out of his book. Most of his stuff had words, but not this one. Out of context, I might have said it was a scene from Star Wars where it looked like the black or white lightsabers were reflecting blaster bolts. But no one had a blaster. The counselor, who already hated him, takes a page from the art teacher's classroom and almost made a federal case about how he was depicting blood and violence. The school board was involved, and when the page was inserted back into the book, it was clear that the page was about Harry Potter. This was just as they were announcing the first movie. The school board questioned the red, and he said it was the only color pen he had, aside from dark blue, which didn't look well against the black. Mom explained how the counselor hounded him for looking poor, and it was because they were indeed poor. At the end of the meeting, there was no apology given. The page was retained by the counselor. At school, the page wasn't given to the art teacher either, and after getting an A in the class, somehow the computer system was hacked, and he got an F showing zeros on all assignments. The only contribution I made over the drama was to suggest that a room full of witnesses saw the counselor take the page when he left. It was actually in the minutes that Mom protested when the page was separated from the book again. File a theft report. I wrote a check for $500 to the kid for, in the memo, incomplete art book. This was to assign value and he got to keep the money. We told the police I would pay $5,000 for the last page, making it grand theft. They found the page in his office as we expected, but naturally we had to go to court to explain the value. Thus is where the art teacher came in. She, as a non-interested party and only expert to have seen the page, explained that it is really worth what the market would bear. She even agreed the missing page was more valuable to the book if it were whole, because art is meant to excite emotion. Register redacted is clearly emotional, as the page made him think of blood and violence. Keeping the page means he is connected to this art in an intimate way. Later, we showed how preventing the sale of the complete work cost the artist money. In the end, he only got 6 months probation and had to pay $5,000 reparations. We still didn't get the page back from evidence for quite some time. In total, he went from sophomore to senior before the book was finally complete. In a twist of in-your-faceness, the Harry Potter movie was out and the kids ransacked the school library for the books. The boy asked if he could display the other pages in the library. We got a frame so he could change the pages out whenever he wanted, and we put a card on it that said Harry Potter interpreted by school student, the boy on loan by OP. He has long since graduated. I donated the book back to him when it was finally complete. And I know up until the Deathly Hallows he kept putting his art in the library. Sounds like he's got a real Snape on his hands. No spoilers, by the way. I'm only on the 3rd movie. Story 21. Maybe missed the boat here, but here it goes. I am a fully qualified art teacher, but when I was a cover teacher, I was in an art lesson and had to present someone else's lesson plan. Students were to invent or draw a new musical instrument, then decorate and color it. One group of cocky lads were not doing the work, so I chatted to them and they began drawing. I went back over to the table a few moments later, and one had drawn a massive chicken on the page. I picked up the work and said in an utterly deadpan way, "What an unusual instrument, Jack. How do you play it?" His mates all snickered as Jack went red in the face. "Do you strum it, Jack, or do you blow it?" The kid was dying, much to my delight, but it was going to get worse. Once I had finished with him, there was a knock at the door. It was his head of year. The HOY then proceeded to ask the same exact questions as me. Most of the class was now involved in hilarity, but could it get worse? As if telepathically, the HOY and I said in sync, "This is excellent work, Jack. Let's send it home so your mom can see." Story 22. Late to the party, but the local businesses used to invite my elementary school to paint on their windows during Halloween. Usually just malformed pumpkins and crappy-looking ghosts. I, however, was the kid who was good at art at an early age. And I was also really into gore at the time. I was also into Spider-Man comics, so naturally I painted a large spread mural of Venom, holding up Spider-Man's decapitated head, with his spinal column hanging down, dripping with blood, next to his lifeless body. Mary Jane was weeping in the distance. We weren't invited back ever again. But then a few years later, there was a fire, and all the businesses in that small business park burned down. There was another time we were passing around a birthday card for some girl in my class, grade 3 or 4, and I thought it would be a great idea to draw a crowd of people getting blown away by some really buff dude with sunglasses, a cigar, and a Terminator 2 style minigun. On the brick wall behind them, splattered in blood, spelled out, "Happy Birthday." There was at least a dozen other incidents where I was sent to the principal's office or berated by the art teacher for drawing gory stuff. These days, I'm pretty sure I would be locked away in a loony bin, but this was in the 90s where people hadn't lost their minds yet. Story 23. Not an art teacher, but an artist. Senior year of high school, I turned in a colorful watercolor piece of a red, cartoonish but pointy and sinister devil. The background was made up of washes of different colors using varying techniques to make interesting patterns and color interactions. Amongst this and complementary shades of colored pencil winding around the background were the words to a poem I'd written about self-unaliving and shooting myself in the head. I didn't say a word to my art teacher. When turning it in, I don't even think it was an actual assignment, just something I created on my own and turned in for extra credit or something. I was a depressed overachiever. I don't know, I told my art teacher, put it in the school art show that year, and it won third place. My teacher saw it, my classmates saw it, my family even came and saw it. No one said a gosh dang word. I even watched my father start to read it and then look uncomfortable and abruptly stop. But he never said anything. The poem was in block print and easily legible. I remember just kind of thinking, Bautiavrum, and being surprised it won anything, because I really didn't think it was that good. I also once wrote another poem about wanting to die, which I wrote in the margins of one of my math tests. My math teacher just told me I was weird when he handed me the test back. I was later diagnosed with bipolar 2 and am often wanting to sell for a life in my depressive states. But looking back, I'm kind of like, why the F did no one realize I was depressed until I was well into my 20s? Story 24. Late and also not an art teacher, but in high school, a friend and I were both struggling with some stuff, and we had a really cool English teacher who would give guidance, but not be restrictive. We had an assignment to write our own sonnet, and I wouldn't call it cheating, honestly wouldn't call it cheating. Just sort of through talking together, we came up with some good lines, and my friend used them, and it ended up being a poem we decided would fit really well with both self-harm and murder. Was worried the teacher would freak out or something, but if he was uncomfortable, he didn't say it. We always did our work and made good grades, so. Then either still in that year or in the next one, we had the same teacher and had to write a short story based off of a news story. For some reason, I ended up thinking it had to be like a violent news story. I ended up writing about a serial killer based off of a real one. I didn't include any of the sexual torture in the essay that the real serial killer perpetrated because it was a high school class and also because I wasn't sure if we'd have to read them. But I felt like leaving it out completely would I don't know, for one thing it would have made the story more shallow since that was part of the actual happening. But I also felt like it would have disrespected the victims whose story I was telling with my short story. So I included a scene where the killer has his victim stripped and put on different outfits so he can take photos. The outfits weren't sexual and he never touched her, but I wanted to keep the feeling of exploitation in violation. Again, not to be edgy or anything, but because I wanted to be thematically faithful to what the real victims had experienced. I included a scene of the killer murdering her too. It was probably slightly overwrought and stuff. I was a freshman or sophomore, but my professor really liked it and gave me good marks. I felt like I'd created something substantial and used the story without disrespecting the real victims who lived it. Story 25. Not a teacher, but I guess I can imagine what they thought. When I was in high school 25 years ago, we had a writing project in English class. We watched one segment of the movie Cat's Eye called Quitters. In it, a man signs up with a company to help him quit smoking. After we watched it, we were given the assignment of writing a story about someone trying to quit something. As a 17-year-old who read a lot of Stephen King, Dean Kuntz, and Clive Barker, my story came out a little dark. I wrote about a serial killer who killed and ate people's hearts to gain their power, with the ultimate goal of killing a pregnant woman and eating the heart of her and her unborn baby, as the baby's power was yet untapped. After doing that, he comes to the realization that a baby's heart wouldn't give him the most power, but his own heart would. He then quits killing people while he prepared himself to consume his own. The story ended with him trying to cut out his own heart. The story was incredibly graphic in 15 pages instead of the requested 2. A couple of days after turning it in, I was called into the guidance counselor's office, and I was met by him, the vice principal, and my English teacher. They were obviously very disturbed by the story and wanted to ask if I was okay and if things were okay at home. I told them things were fine and listed books that I had recently read. They were like, okay, and let me go. I got an A+ on the story, by the way, and the English teacher was super supportive of me writing more. I do wonder how things would go if I wrote the same story in school today. Story 26, maybe a little off topic here, but relates to kids' artwork. Recently, I was walking home with my girlfriend and was stopped by these 3 kids outside their home. "Excuse me, sir. Would you like to buy some of our artwork for 5 pence?" said the oldest kid, who must have been around 7 at most. His sisters were around 5 or under. I thought it was pretty sweet, so ended up giving the kids a couple of pounds for a picture of a butterfly, which was on a piece of bright green paper drawn rather messily with a blue crayon. The kids said to me that because I was their best customer, I could get a bonus piece of art from the Lucky Dip draw. I put my hand in a bowl of screwed up bits of paper and pulled out my bonus piece of art. When I unfolded the piece of paper, I was surprised to see that there was no drawing, but instead a message. There in big writing were the words, "Be a man." My girlfriend could not stop laughing, and I was left standing speechless as 3 kids just stood there grinning and thanking me for my customer. Story 27, I'm a teacher but not an art teacher. But I do have creepy stories. I once worked with a brother and sister who had serious mental health issues. For example, the little girl 5, when I first met her, was convinced that she wanted to become a pole dancer. She knew what that job entailed, and she would try to fully demonstrate her knowledge at every possible opportunity. We regularly had to separate her from the other kids because she wouldn't stop touching them inappropriately. The brother was older, but very delayed. At 7, he wasn't able to count or name any letters. He couldn't recognize his own name on a paper. He was prone to violent acts, and we had to keep a close eye on him to make sure he didn't hurt any of the other kids. One day, the little girl announced that she was drawing me a picture. When she was finished, she came up to me and smiled and said very sweetly, "This is for you. It's a picture of you in bed. That's me next to you smashing your head in with a baseball bat." I wish I had saved that picture, but I'm pretty sure I burned it. I ended up running into them years later. The little girl still had extremely odd and sometimes inappropriate behaviors. The boy was in special ed and still very delayed, but the mom was convinced he was totally fine and a genius. I should add, both of the kids were now heavily medicated. Story 28, art student of Reddit here, and the Lord of Lecture Doodle. Let me see if I can recount that Time's permanent record was the destination of my paintings. 3rd grade. Had to do a book report. Didn't read one, but I knew they made most books into movies and assumed Die Hard was one of them. And I'd seen it a few times. Great cover art, math worksheet in 4th grade, picture of a clown you could connect the dots with by doing math problems. I drew a bullet in his forehead. You could read 50 caliber and a blood splatter because I was terrified of clowns. She took it to mean I was a serial killer. 7th grade. Drew a picture of our El Natural hippie teacher as a Sasquatch, which was noticed and taken from me. Had to see the counselor for behavioral problems. 9th grade. Drew William Wallace murdering a friend of mine with a Morning Star flail and threw the note at him via paper airplane. It curved and went right to the teacher's feet. 11th grade. Compilation essay drawing of the same friend with Kermit the Frog and Dee Snider of Twisted Sister taking turns on him. He was basically skewered by a giant Kermit chicken that extended out his mouth. Dee was saying, "I bet he'll take it." Both parents had to meet with the principal for this one. Yikes, 12th grade. Opened a bottle of liver of sulfur, and a few of us painted a kid's hair with it and referred to him as our project. They needed to shut down the cafeteria that day due to the smell, and the instructor had a mental breakdown. Story 29. Not exactly submitted, but I had a kid bring in his sketchbook, 8th grade science, which is normally totally okay. He kept it on his lap under the table and was completely enthralled in whatever he was drawing. I asked him a couple of times, and it was clear that he was so focused on his work, he wasn't paying any attention to class. So I told him, "Your sketchbook has become a distraction. I need you to put it away." Of course he did. I asked maybe once or twice more, and finally told him I had to take it because he was not cooperating. He freaked out. "That's my personal property. You can't take that." Normally he would have gotten it back at the end of class, but he was being an a-hole. And I love having the conversation with 8th graders about how everything they own belongs to their parents. So I told him I would make sure I left it in the office for his mom to pick it up at the end of the day. He was not okay with this. Now, before he left class, we had a chat, and I opened the book to find it full of graphic hentai. I, at that point, let him know I had to write a report in his file about bringing NSFW material to school. On his way out, I told him, "You obviously spend too much time on the internet." The most awkward part was not discussing hentai with an 8th grader, where I learned hentai actually means pervert in Japanese, but standing in the teacher's lounge making copies of hentai. Poor first grade teacher just wanted to copy. Go dog go. Oh, story 30. I took a ceramics class in high school. The assignments were all pretty cool, making statues replicating small objects. Mine was a tube of toothpaste. One thing we were taught is that you can't have any enclosed air pockets in your designs because in the oven the air expands and things explode. So making a tube of toothpaste, my options were to either make the tube out of solid clay or to add a strategic air hole to my tube to allow hot air to escape. Most people elected to use the air hole technique because clay was limited and you could build more things if all of your projects weren't solid. But this caveat to ceramics presented a unique opportunity for students and a unique challenge for our poor old teacher. People realized really quickly that with a few strategic holes and some cleverly placed cup-like structures, they could potentially smoke out of their creations. Yeah, kids tried it. I don't think anyone was incredibly successful. If the object was blatantly a smoking vehicle, it would mysteriously break in the oven, or the teacher would fill in a weak point. We all suspected that she knew what the kids were up to, but no one knew for sure. One kid in my year, the lacrosse captain, was bound and determined to create the ultimate homemade smoking vehicle. He would try and fail repeatedly to make something work, and anything that looked like it would work was mysteriously modified, presumably by our teacher, before it went into the kiln. The mods could have been random chance, a small crack here, a hole collapsed there, a bowl portion broke off, etc. One evening, I was meeting with our teacher about an unrelated class trip she was in charge of. She was unloading the kiln. It was statue day. We had to make statues out of a large comb base. We were advised to make certain parts removable for easy transport. She gets to the lacrosse captain statue, and she's shaking her head, clearly stumped as to how he could possibly turn this into paraphernalia. Then she pops the head off. I can't see inside the statue, but she just lets out a, "Oh, you son of a female dog." I peer over the rim, and inside is a masterfully crafted, fully glazed bowl, complete with carb and mouthpiece suspended inside the statue, on little metal stilts used generally for keeping flat glazed objects from melting to the kiln. This mother effer has been pulling this crap all year, and he's lucky I've got a sense of humor, but I can't let him keep this. She yanks the piece out and moves to toss it into the trash, but hesitates, glances the piece over and pockets it right in front of me. I'm sort of flabbergasted at this point. I've never heard of this sweet old lady utter an ounce of profanity in 6 months. She notices my reaction and says, "What? How the heck do you think I became an art teacher?" Story 31. Not exactly an answer to your question, but the story relates. When I was in art school, I had a series of work about wanting to self-unalive thoughts. It was sourced from my own prior experiences, and the imagery was often ambiguous. From the get-go, my professor was concerned, but I couldn't be swayed from working on it. I had been making work about depression for 2 years at that point and thought that I had it all under control. She was supportive in what way she could be. When working on a series, you consistently think about the work all day, every day. It seems rather obvious now that I was being stupid. About 3 months in, I had a really scary breakdown. A few days after I met with my professor, her assurance that there was no shame in needing to leave some art unmade for the sake of my mental health was something I took to heart. I've been doing well ever since, aside from the crippling doubt that comes with the territory of being an artist. Story 32. I was the kid. After being relentlessly tormented by a group of kids in my class, while the teacher did nothing and then getting yelled at by the librarian for being in the bathroom for too long because I was crying, I ended up having a huge mental breakdown and a screaming fit in my gym class at every individual kid and told them why I hated them. This breakdown lasted at least 10 minutes of me just ranting and crying because of the terrible crap these kids have done, full detail in front of the teacher. Very soon after I stopped, I was sat down in front of the principal, who immediately handed me a piece of paper and told me to draw my feelings. I was 10 and immediately felt super patronized and even more upset that no one in the school was listening to me scream that I was being bullied, so I drew myself stabbing the principal with a knife. I only had one black marker though, and wasn't exactly peaking artistically, so I don't think she actually caught on that it was her or what the picture was of. I did eventually get into therapy in university and am actually pursuing a career in comics, so apparently that picture was kind of the start of my career. Story 33. Not a teacher, but in middle school, I was furious with my math teacher, Mr. Rice. He had given me an extra project trying to be nice since he saw I was bored and I was upset about how he graded it. So in art class, I drew a hugely complex graphite drawing with poor kind Mr. Rice getting unalive in a variety of ways. Knives, heavy things, falling run over by a car, etc. Well, I had problems with nosebleeds back then and got one when I was most of the way done. Instead of taking care of it, I dripped it all over the drawing and then smeared the blood with an eraser. I thought it was really, really cool. I turned it in and the teacher was justifiably losing her mind. I got 3 weeks of in-school suspension and no teacher was ever nice enough to give me extra work again. Good call. Other teachers, that was a reasonable decision by you. Story 34. I don't know if this counts, but when I was in 7th grade, my school was K-12. So everyone shared the same art room at different points of the day. There was a 14-year-old or 15-year-old girl who spent all day working on her secret project. I can't remember why she was allowed to spend days doing nothing but paint, maybe some contest or something. Anyway, no one interrupted her, no one went to check on her until the day came when she revealed her painting to her class. I didn't see it, but apparently it was a very realistic piece of herself, completely unclothed and self-massaging, pretty intensely. Could just have been rumors, but the faculty's and parents' reactions make me think it was real. Her being underage, this freaked out a lot of people, made them wonder if she was unclothed in school while painting for inspiration, since she was left alone for so long. Notes were sent home to parents, announcements were made that no student could be alone for more than a few minutes at a time anymore. Policies were changed. I understand why people freaked out about it, but it was just a painting. The poor girl probably felt like a failure after that, despite being probably the top artist in the school. Story 35. When I was a young kid, we had to do a project, which was to draw symbols we recognized. I had a big A3 piece of paper and loved to draw, so was really enjoying the work. I did a peace symbol, a yin and yang, and whatever other symbols I had probably seen in my older sister's room in the early 90s. My favorite symbol of all by far was one I had seen somewhere that was a red square with a white circle in the middle with black symbols inside of it. It looked so striking, and the colors were cool, and I did a really good job of it. I was pretty impressed with myself. I put that female dog right smack bang in the middle. Everything was mint until my teacher came over and saw my work, became visibly upset, and told me to rub it out with an eraser. I argued pretty strongly, but to no avail. I was upset because I was never going to get colors out completely. I'd really drilled them in, which meant she was going to ruin my project. Why, it looked awesome. So what was the problem? It wasn't until years later that I learned what the German flag of the mid-1930s and mid-1940s represented. Story 36. I taught comics and illustrations to middle schoolers for a long time, and sometimes elementary kids in some programs. By the time they hit like 8 or 9, about half the kids are drawing a ton of blood and people being murdered. Most of the replies in this thread are really standard. I had one student do every comic about chainsaw murders. He loved the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There were always pictures of people crying blood and pictures captioned with ridiculous things like, "There is no joy in the world," and "This rose is black like my soul." There was one kid who drew cute little object characters similar to Gudetama, just like an egg with a face, and then would draw them dying. Eggs would be cracked and spilling yolks while screaming, "No!" For example, we also ran jam comics, which is when a student drew a single panel, passed it to the next person to draw the second panel. There was one class where, out of 28 6-panel jam comics passed in a massive circle, exactly one had the character from the first panel survive. These weren't disturbed kids either. It was an expensive program, and the vast majority were privileged white kids from the suburbs who were just going through their preteen to early teen edgelord phase. The one incident that actually sticks out, however, was this one student out in a rural area. She was probably about 11, and they were making characters and writing short descriptions. Her 8 characters included an alcoholic, a pregnant 9-year-old, a 12-year-old girl in a relationship with a 2-year-old girl, and crap like that. It was a little horrifying, to say the least. She was a bit of a weird kid, and it seemed like she was doing it for attention, I think. I only had a 2-hour workshop with her, and the head of the program was completely unconcerned, so nothing ever happened about it. Story 37. Somewhat related. Back in high school, I had a notebook. I would doodle in it. I was a dumb teenager with a similar sense of humor. I drew weird stuff or silly ideas, nothing really serious. I lost my notebook at one point. Eventually it was found and I was called in to see the principal. I had to sit there and explain so many drawings. The worst was trying to explain the picture of a refrigerator effing an oven. My principal said these were extremely disturbing drawings and that they were not normal. F that guy. F you, Mr. Alger. We all know you only fired the volleyball coach because it was your daughter who finally got essayed. Story 38. Not an art teacher, but for the entirety of first grade and part of second grade, I drew every single human figure complete with genitalia in pen or pencil. Then I would just color on the clothing with crayons or markers or whatnot. It was the 80s, so I didn't have to talk to any counselors or anything. Nobody even made an issue about that kind of stuff back then. I wasn't essayed as far as I know. I just liked to read through my family's encyclopedia set for fun as best as I could. And as a result, I was well aware of human anatomy already. I was just trying to make my drawings realistic, since we do indeed have bodies under our clothes, and in a lot of instances, the outlines of our sensitive bits are indeed visible. I reasoned that by mimicking the notion that the unclothed body exists first, then we put on clothes after. The process would result in better art, I thought. I could only imagine the crap storm such a thing would cause these days. When I began to understand that people associated visible genitals with shame, they naturally stopped making an appearance in my drawings. Story 39. Not disturbing, but more confusing. 5-year-old presented me with a photo of a full-on unclothed bald man. Only place of hair was his nipples. When I asked why, he responded, "So he won't be cold." I couldn't argue with him, but could only recommend that he give him clothes too, just in case. Clarification and edit. 1. Yes, I meant drawing, not photo. Thankfully, I commented quickly. 2. I wish I took a picture, but this was during an art camp, and they have a strict no cell phone electronic device policy. Even the campers can get in crap for taking out their phone unless strictly given permission to use it for reference. This is especially enforced with small kids. Even with extreme background checks, you can never be too careful. 3. I was barred at 3 different places for 4 years before I began my current and thankfully full-time job. 4. Other things I've seen. A child paint a horse with legs that look like chickens. Several adults at different times lick their paintbrush out of curiosity. Teachers refuse to have male students use purple or pink since they are girl colors. A 13-year-old crap his pants. A 14-year-old crap her pants. An 8-year-old crap her pants. A 4-year-old pee his pants and then on my foot. An 11-year-old pee her pants at the beginning of the day and decide to sit in wet pants instead of getting a change of clothes. A 12-year-old crap his pants and refuse to change into anything but a diaper fashioned out of tension bandages from a first aid kit. Helicopter parents scared of their son getting paint on his hands. A teacher tell her kids to all shut up to ask for the Wi-Fi password. Then proceed to leave the room in a huff to speak to a manager. When I apologized and said we didn't, a teacher tell me to not allow any of the students with mental disabilities to answer any of my questions, even if they were the only ones with their hands up. A kid bust her arm right open on a paper towel dispenser. I still don't know how this happened. An 86-year-old woman crap her pants, and who couldn't walk, give her a wheelchair to me when 911 was called and I couldn't walk. A teacher make a bunch of racist remarks to Mexico and Asia. A child with little communication skills paint the most amazing landscape of a person on a beach that she simply said was her. More people than I want to admit who don't know that blue is a primary color and that green isn't made by mixing orange and yellow. And the most amazing important that everyone is an artist because art is a way of expressing yourself. And just because you're struggling with drawing or painting doesn't mean you're bad at art. You just simply aren't using the right tools for you. Whew. Story 40. I was an art teacher at a violence against women shelter. I worked with kids of all ages, and sometimes if they didn't want to do art, they would read or play with the toys or color. One day, a 4-year-old wants to read me a book. He can't read, but I say, sure, why not? A few minutes in, I realize he's telling me the story of his mom having a meltdown the morning he was evicted, and the police came to his apartment. He's just flipping pages, casually telling the story somehow, relating it to this book. Although it may not be so disturbing, it was really sad. Another time I told this kid to paint whatever he wanted, and I just found out that he had been S8 for years. He painted the word hope. I hung it up. Not disturbing, but that hurt something in me and has stayed with me for years. Edit. Didn't realize some people thought they were the same kid. The kid who did the hope painting was 11. The kid who read me the story was 4. Story 41. I was in a fraternity in college. Lived in the fraternity house for 2 years. Best time I never want to have again. Anyways, next door to our fraternity house is a Kinder Care. Yeah, I don't know why they did that, but they did. Anyways, my senior year, one of our fraternity brothers died when he crashed his motorcycle. We don't know how he crashed, but he did hit his head and died. Apparently, he was unconscious till he got to the hospital and crashed when they put him in a medical-induced coma. As a kind gesture, the daycare ladies made the kids write us cards and delivered all of them to us. I don't think the teachers looked through all of them, because some of them were kind of brutal. Keep in mind, these kids are like preschool age to kindergarten. One of them was simple but cold. On the front it said, "Hey," and then you open up the card to a drawing of a watch and the bold words "time limit." We were shocked, to say the least. There was a lot of confusion on whether or not we were being threatened by a 6-year-old. Another one drew a picture of our house and it looked like a legit prison. Bars instead of windows and everything. Another one said, "I hope your friend stops being dead or else you'll never see them again." That one was quite disturbing, and that's all I can remember for now. I'll text a couple of my buddies I still keep in touch with and see if they can remember more. Story 42. Kind of an anecdotal entry. My mom is an educator. She told me of a student she had who admitted that he had once been sent to the school psychiatrist. You see, he drew all of this crayon drawings in black. House and families done in black outline. Animals and oceans, black. Grass and plants, black. Mick Jagger had nothing on this kid. As it turns out, this kid wasn't a sociopath. He wasn't depressed and angry. He didn't want to kill his parents. No, he was just totally colorblind, and his table mates at art class always stuck him with the black crayon and hoarded all the colors for themselves. Since he couldn't tell the difference anyway, he was more than happy to oblige. It. Ow, my inbox. I can't spell well sometimes, especially when it's late and I'm tired. It turns out the word spelling is apocryphal. Oops. Thanks for the pointers. I've had numerous other people question the validity of the story and the kid's color blindness. Like I said, this is a story that's basically been told through 3 people, so I can't verify its validity. But my basic understanding was this. Kid was 100% colorblind, could only see white, black, and shades of gray. His kindergarten class organized art into table groups that required them to share crayons. His friends always gave him the black one, while they hoarded all the other colors. Story 43. I've been teaching art for 9 years. The most disturbing image I've ever run across was from 5-year-old who was visiting our campus for the day to see if our school was a match for him. He joined our 1st grade class, and I had assigned our students to create an environment around an object that I'd cut out and pasted onto a blank sheet of paper. The objects were from home and living magazines, so the images were mostly food, furniture, animals, cars, etc. The child who was visiting was given a paper with an antique bathtub glued onto it. This kid proceeded to draw a person being murdered in the bathtub, with people looking in through the bathroom windows smiling at the murder. The image was pretty insane. When I asked him about why he drew this, he said, "This is the kind of stuff I like." I told him that I was going to keep it and give it to his mom when she came back to pick him up. As class was ending, he swiped the drawing off my desk, crumpled it up, and threw it into the boys' bathroom trash. I pulled the drawing out of the trash, showed it to our school dean, and explained what happened. Thankfully, he wasn't admitted to school that year. Story 44. Not a teacher, but I am the legal guardian of my nephew now for reasons that will become obvious. I used to pick him up regularly from his infant school as his mother, my sister, is a waste of space. One day his teacher pulled me to the side and pulled out a picture he had drawn. Took me a moment to realize what I was seeing before it focused into a picture of a woman with blood around her and needles scattered around. Teacher was very concerned, and I mean borderline calling police and social services and not letting him leave with me. I asked my nephew, who was about 6 at the time, what this was about. He explains that this is what his mommy looks like most nights. I break down crying, the teacher breaks down crying. I call social services myself from the headmaster's office. They place him in my care as temporary measure and investigate. Turns out my sister had started to take hard drugs via needles and accidentally broke a vein one night, hence the blood. 6 years later, I don't know if she's clean, But my nephew lives with me and my family as if he is my own, and he has never been happier. His now former teacher is a good family friend and regularly comes around and brings her kids. Update, edit well. Thank you for the overwhelming support. Obviously, there will be people with views from the other side, and I do agree with them to a degree. My sister was troubled before she started on the drugs and spiraled her life out of control. We did try and help her, but anything we tried was met with anger and abuse unless it was money, food, or gifts that she could sell or swap for drugs. This went on for a few months before the school incident put it over the edge for me. My nephew did miss meals or go to school in dirty clothes a couple of times before the drugs were involved, and each time it happened, I would take him to my home with my wife and kids and make excuses for my sister's behavior. We would help by having him for a few nights and get him new clothes, make sure he ate, paid for his school dinners, etc. In the end, it was hurting him more doing these things than sending him back to her to start again a few weeks later. Please remember this was a 5 to 6-year-old boy who had to learn that sometimes mommy couldn't feed him when he got home because she didn't care enough. I have honestly tried to make her a part of his life, but was met with almost complete disinterest. Story 45. When I was around 9 or 10, my parents forced me to attend a private religious school. And I mean, it's one of those extremist religious schools where they try to scare you into believing. So as you can imagine, religion was ingrained in pretty much every aspect of the curriculum. We were told to paint or depiction of said God we were supposed to believe in. It wasn't all too surprising that a large portion of these kids, along with myself, portrayed terrifying, menacing depictions of a God surrounded in fire, death, and decay. Some of the kids even drew God throwing them into a pit of fire. I think there were only 1 or 2 kids who actually had a positive illustration. There was a pretty big crap storm about it within our school. We didn't even realize what we were doing. We were just mimicking the stories we were told. Edit. Didn't think this comment would get so much attention. To expand upon the crap storm, yes, the students were blamed and to some degree punished. I won't go into too much detail, but basically the school's administration had special speakers come in and talk to us. Then they also made my class take a special Bible elective for the rest of the year. They did this to appease most of the kids' parents and to smooth over how hateful their preachings truly were. I went to the school for only 5 years of my life, and yet I still go to therapy because of it 15 years later. Story 46. So I am not a teacher, but I had the disturbed spoiler, he wasn't and still isn't child, that the teachers were concerned about one particular art-painting combo my son drew in 1st grade. So I'm going to try to make this short. So in my oldest son's first year of preschool, he discovered deer hunting by the way of his dad. Cool, no problem. We live in a rural area where that is common. Eventually, through 2 years of preschool into kindergarten, my son evolved into an obsession with Army anything. Wars, battles, all of it. Sorry I came back to add American wars and battles as we live in the USA. I honestly thought it was pretty cool that while other boys his age like dinos or Superman, whatever my son loved to read about the American Revolution or the Battle of Gettysburg, the more detailed the better. Not necessarily about the death or dying, but he was very interested in the different uniforms, the metal saddles of the horses, what they ate, that kind of stuff. Okay, so flip to week 3 of 1st grade. I get a phone call that I needed to come to his school immediately. They said my son was fine, but it was extremely important. So I rushed there while trying to get a hold of his father, which proved hopeless. I get to the school and walk in the office and immediately know something's off. In the vice principal's office is where we converged. Art teacher, his teacher principal VP, my son police officer and school counselor. So I immediately go into mom freak out mode. Talk was exchanged. I gathered that my son made a painting or drawing that concerned the teachers, that this may be something going on at home. So I said, okay, let's see the picture. It was very clearly to me immediately and to the rest after I said it, that what he drew and painted was a battlefield scene complete with a hospital tent that had severed limbs, people shooting, being stabbed with bayonets, blood everywhere. As good as a 1st grader can paint and draw, which wasn't great, obviously, holy crap, I had to just take a deep breath as I looked at it. He's 10 now, still loves Army, Navy, Marines wars, and still loves to draw. But if that wasn't the scariest 15 minutes of my life, whew. Story 47. I know this will be buried, and it's sort of the opposite of the OP's question, but I'll answer anyway. I lived in Long Beach, California until I was 10. When I was in 1st grade, we had a field trip to Bolsa Chica, a local and ecologically important wetlands. For most children, the highlight of the trip had been the lone sandpiper we saw with its long legs, allowing to see above the grasses, and its large feet and small body weight, making it hard to detect. After returning from our field trip, our assignment had been to draw what we had seen. Most drew the sandpiper, a few more some other small animals, but I drew what I had seen for most of the trip: black sand and a few long grass stalks. The next week, my mother was calling me to go to the beach. I was so excited, I was so excited, I was so excited. Grass stalks. The next week, my mother was called to a parent-teacher conference. I normally was top of my class in most things, so she was a bit surprised. My teacher let her know I had done a drawing that may indicate developmental disabilities or abuse, and showed her my drawing. My mother's response was that marshes were dark and sparsely vegetated, and there was nothing wrong with my drawing, because that is what I saw. My mom is not particularly maternal or nice, but her standing up for me was one of the great moments in my childhood. Story 48, oh boy, a threat I can answer. During my degree, my department school of bioscience and biomedicine had a day where primary school children came to the labs. We ran different stands, some students doing finger painting, some doing exercise, and then measuring heart rate and all that crap. The only decent one was dissection. The students were dissecting a pig heart and explaining how the heart works to the little kids. The children could opt out if they thought it was too scary. Only one little boy did, and he did a word search instead. Anyway, after the day, the kids had to fill in a sheet that said, "My favorite thing about the day was..." Nearly every kid wrote, "dissecting the heart." One kid drew a very crude picture of a man with what appeared to be a pistol, the same size as him. Just a right-angle set of square-looking thing firing balls at the poorly drawn pig with lines and squiggles and lots of gore coming out. Pig labeled pig gun, labeled bazooka, man labeled terrorist. I don't know how exactly that boy experienced the heart dissection, but he seemed to really like it a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our stories of the wonderful imagination of children and some other disturbing things. If you have any stories that you would like to include in the comments below, feel free to do that. And as always, thank you for listening along. I don't know when this comes out, but happy holidays. Story 49, the teacher, the student. In 3rd or 4th grade, we did a unit in one of our classes on those really complicated machines that did very simple things. I forget what they're called. Anyway, as a project, the teacher had us draw our own. Well, bacon was, and still is, one of my favorite foods, so I made a bacon machine. The way this machine worked, you put a cat or dog on a treadmill, which would turn a conveyor belt, which would cause a pig to fall on a bunch of knives. Then the strips of pigs would fall onto a skeleton cook, which would then tip somehow and fall onto my plate so I could eat the bacon. When I drew said machine, I obviously included the animals involved. So basically, I turned in a picture of a smiling pig falling to its death, with myself waiting at the bottom to eat it. I imagine this would have been a bit of a shock to the teacher, especially coming from a seemingly shy, sweet 8-year-old girl. Story 50, starting here with disturbing art. In 8th grade, I read Stephen King's apt pupil story, which, spoiler warning, is about a kiddo who takes an interest in World War II, and more specifically, the Holocaust. His neighbor turns out to be a war criminal who ran Patton and was head of some messed up stuff. The old man wants peace, but the kid blackmails him into telling the kid everything that happened there. They both blackmail each other over the years and ruin each other. They secretly are friends and need one another in a sense, but at the same time, they want to murder each other too. Old man returns to his Nazi ways, practicing on animals and eventually hobos. Kiddo feels nothing kills homeless people secretly too. Eventually, the kid snaps and just starts shooting people. This is a very fast version that doesn't do the story enough justice. End of spoilers. Now, the story in the whole book, different seasons, which I still greatly enjoy, left quite the impression on me. I usually adopt the mentality of the characters of the books I read. Frankenstein and Heart of Darkness made me so weird as a person until I picked up the next book. In art, though, my Todd and Dusender apartment people characters really shines through. And I drew this massive picture of like a World War II era gas mask that bled and cried green toxic and gas through the eye holes. The mask also dripped green stuff. While this was a cringy, awkward phase, I still had the decency, I guess, to not draw like blood or gore. It had a cartoony vibe to it that I guess didn't make people question my sanity. There was a barbed fence in the background that I added because I thought of when Magneto was taken from his mom in X-Men 1. I just had a shadowy figure on the other side of the fence, though. Story 51. I'm not sure if I would call this submitted artwork, but I teach 100% at-risk high schoolers in the inner city. We take the worst of the worst, been kicked out of every school in and out of jail. We even take kids who have been kicked out of other alternative schools. If they are here, it's because they have nowhere else to go. I love my job to death, but just giving you a bit of my background. So my first year teaching, I had a student who was at best unstable and at worst completely off the charts crazy, like seriously needed more help than we could give her. Unfortunately, she was pleasant enough, but was known for going into fits of rage, talking to herself, hurting herself, threatening people with sharp objects, etc. Her biggest quirk was that she always drew a Star of David on every single assignment before she turned it in. Being a Jew, I thought it was pretty interesting that she kept doing that. So one day I pulled her aside and asked her why. The conversation went something like this. "Hey, can I ask you something?" "Yes, of course." "I noticed you keep drawing this Star of David on every paper you turn in. I was just wondering if there was any reason why." "Oh yeah, I am really into Satan. I love him and I keep trying to summon him with it." Seriously, that's what went through my head as I stood there stupefied. As I composed myself, I asked her politely to quit drawing that on her papers. She did, but then she started drawing it on the desks and chairs. The last one I saw was a Star of David with 60C6 written inside of it. Side note, she eventually got the mental help she needed when she was committed after she stabbed one of her parapros in the head with a lead pencil and broke it off inside his skull. Story 52, first grade. The children were given an assignment to draw a picture and write a short story about what they would do over summer vacation. As I walked around the room helping the children with spelling, I noticed one student using a lot of red crayon. I stopped by his desk and saw he had made a dog with its tail flying off in the air in a big red gush like water from a fire hose coming out of its butt. There were 5 brown circles in the red and what looked like a bean with 2 big X's on it. Above the dog's head, there was a bunch of colorful, squiggly lines and a shovel. I honestly had no clue what was going on here, but it made me uncomfortable. I asked him how this was related to summer vacation. He told me his dog just pooped out a bunch of babies, but one died. He said he was going to have a funeral for the dead one and throw a birthday party for the alive ones. Thank goodness I allowed him to explain it. Truly looked like he was going to use a live dog as a piñata over the summer. Story 53. I'm not an art teacher, but I used to have a classmate in grades 1 through 3 that was really into drawing fire on everything. Every art project wound up having fire in it. Draw the pilgrims for Thanksgiving. They're on fire. The houses, the people, the food paint snowflakes for Christmas. Santa made an appearance and he was on fire, as well as the reindeer, and houses and gifts. 4th of July artwork. Perfect, more fire. Probably on the spectators at the bottom, caused by the fireworks. The real interesting part was that you always knew when he was drawing fire because he'd make this hissing, whooshing sound with his mouth as he drew it. It was like he was adding his own flamethrower sounds because he was the flamethrower. I remember the teachers used to audibly groan when they'd hear him or see his artwork and tell him that he can't be drawing fire and everything. But it didn't matter. He did what he wanted. I have no idea what happened to him after 3rd grade. His sister still came to our school all the way through graduation, but I never saw him again. Story 54. Not an art teacher, but had a teacher throw a fit about one of my son's drawings. Got the principal and the counselor involved. I got called to an emergency meeting over highly disturbing material. I'm all concerned as you get when called to an emergency conference. They show me the highly disturbing drawing. I almost fell about laughing. It was a drawing of the Headless Horseman. We'd been playing a Halloween seek and find puzzle game together. Kid was like 8 or 9. They draw what's on their mind. I explain why I think it's so funny and I get the stink eye and tut-tut and cat butt face. I then remind them that Disney felt the Headless Horseman appropriate enough to make a cartoon about it and told them to shove it. They weren't happy about that, but they couldn't really argue it, especially as his occupational therapist has suggested we do seek and find type puzzles together. Suck it. Highly disturbing. My butt cheeks. Story 55. I'm a bit late to the party, but I taught English and I had the kids come up with their own inventions, and they had to create advertisements for them. This one kid came up with the baby stapler. For when you didn't want to babysit or got tired of your baby, you would staple it to the wall. He drew it in detail. Had to call the principal in for that one. That kid was such a spoiled little punk, he also picked on special ed kids. Also, I had one student that the other teachers whispered was so creepy, and one teacher swore up and down he would be a school shooter. He wrote really dark poetry and would draw knives. I was the young new teacher at the time, so he got kicked out of his other classes, stuck in my poetry elective class. That kid was so cool. I sat down and chatted with him, and I discovered that he would draw knives because his uncle knew how to smith or make knives, and his uncle would sometimes create the knives from his designs. He also wrote some really beautiful poetry. It was dark at first, but once he got past trying to shock me and live up to his reputation, he wrote some great stuff. Even wrote some in a different language. I was really proud to say I made a connection with that kid when it seemed like everyone else just washed their hands of him. Apparently, he had a pretty awful home life too. I hope he's doing well now. Story 56. Not an art teacher, but when I was in high school, we were supposed to be painting self-portraits. I finished mine pretty quickly, and I was just screwing around. Having just discovered that I was pretty good at painting, I ended up painting an incredibly accurate, small 4x4 profile of my math teacher. Knowing full well that this is not something I was going to show anyone, because I'd get detention, I then threw it out. Later on that day, I got called down to the dean of students, and when I entered his office, I saw the painting on his desk and another kid in my class sitting across from him. Before I got to say anything, I was threatened with expulsion for drawing a caricature of a respected member of the faculty. Turns out one of my classmates had found it in the garbage and brought it to the library to make copies with a couple of inappropriate phrases added when he was caught. He ratted me out for painting it and then essentially pulled the 10th grade version of pleading the fifth. I had to explain to the dean that I had just started learning how to paint, and that's what started out as just shapes and colors sort of became a pretty good likeness of the teacher. I had thrown the painting out because I knew the painting likeness of the teachers without their permission was not a good idea. My co-conspirator confirmed that he took it out of the garbage, and I was finally let go. Pretty sure the kid was suspended. I was not allowed to paint portraits anymore in class, though. Story 57. When I was a first-year art teacher at a high school, there was a student whose family managed to immigrate to the U.S. She was a 15-year-old freshman, spoke perfect English, and was a very capable artist. I could tell she had some problems going on in the background, but she never talked about whatever it was. We had been finishing up a series of lessons about facial proportions for drawing self-portraits. And instead of turning in a self-portrait of herself for her final project, she turned in a pair of portraits of two Middle Eastern males, one young and the other much older. Confused, I asked her about them. Apparently, the younger man was her current boyfriend, that she was keeping a secret from her parents. They had been seeing each other for at least a year, and she was madly in love with him. But her parents would never approve of their relationship, because the portrait of the older man she had drawn was a guy in his 40s back in Pakistan that they were setting her up into an arranged marriage with. She desperately didn't want to marry this man after she graduated high school and wanted to be with the other fellow who was her age. She was crying as she explained the situation, telling me that apparently this is common where her family is from. I had heard of arranged marriages but had never really encountered someone who had personally been a part of one. Like an unfamiliar American, I encouraged her to talk to a counselor or to talk to her parents and explain to them that this arrangement was against her wishes. They had threatened to disown her if she didn't go through with it, and she remarked she would rather unalive herself than marry this man. As soon as she said that my hands were tied, I pretty much had to report the situation to my principal, to the counselors, and to the district police. She finished the year with us, and then she was gone. I have no idea what happened to her. I can only hope she's okay wherever she is. This was 7 years ago. Story 58. I have a good one from a high school in Tokyo I used to teach at. I signed a group presentation project where the students had to invent a product and act out a television commercial for the product in front of the class. The students always got extremely involved with these projects. One group of 3 boys came up and introduced their product as the panty detection device. Awesome. One boy played the part of a man using the device. Another boy played the part of the device itself. The final boy wore various panties on his face representing exactly what you think it represents. The man adjusts the device while the device boy makes beeping sounds. The panty boy comes out wearing very small yokai watch panties on his face. The device makes a danger beeping sound and it warns the man, "Too young, too young." Next, the panty boy comes out wearing panties on his face with red liquid dripping out of it. The device warns, "Period, she has her period." Sitting down at the back of the class, I squint and notice that there is indeed a pad stuffed against the student's face in the panties. The panty boy returns this time, wearing big white diapers on his face and a gray-haired wig. "Too old, not grandma," the device shouts. The panty boy comes out wearing a sexy thong on his face and some blush on his cheeks. Romantic music starts playing. The man gasps. The device proclaims, "It is beautiful." The device beeping escalates until it explodes, falls down on the classroom floor. The man falls to his knees and shouts, "I love you, sexy panty girl." The panty boy prances over to the man on his knees, extends his hand, lifts him up, and then hold each other dancing to the music. Finally, the device stands up and announces the ending to this commercial. Dance with your fantasies using the one and only panty detection device. Only $5. Get it now before your soulmate's panties fly away. The students clap. We move on to our next presentation. A group of girls with their cookie-making cutie gloves. Story 59. Not a teacher, but in high school, I had an art teacher who always called us little uneducated craps and belittled our parents. Never in front of them, of course, because they never took us to fancy events like opera or museums, letting us have fun instead of forcing us to appreciate the finer things in life. Everybody loved him for his use of swear words. I always hated him, though, and I wasn't the only one. He had to take his kid to work for a couple of days for an emergency, and that little kid was wonderful with us without being awful to him, never calling him Dad, but always using his first name. He used to draw his dad dead in various creative ways, with the most graphic one being him executed by hanging with a bear trap on his foot and wolves eating his dangling feet. He then proceeded to take a pin and pin it on the chalkboard. I love that kid with all my heart. The teacher was then found with a 15-year-old boy in his room during a school trip, and he didn't lose his job. He was just banned from going to school trips. Everybody keeps loving him still. I can't understand people. Story 60. I worked in a residential treatment center for young children in the early 90s. It was a very sad place that didn't do a great job at meeting the needs of these young kids. There was one 8-year-old boy who acted out all of the time and spent most of his time heavily medicated due to his violent outbursts. One of the staff treated him like a monster without even seeing the sad little boy trapped inside. The kid could string curse words together in a way that I have never even considered, and he could kick the butt of all the older kids by fighting dirty. It was scary to watch, and most staff reacted with the same violence and verbal abuse back towards him. I ended up on his unit for the night shift. I began reading him books at night, which had probably never been done before. Slowly, he was able to let down some walls, and trust me, he acted like the scared little boy he was with me, and I spent a lot of my time just hugging him while he cried. I was moved off the unit to day shift, and he brought me a drawing on my last night, which was highly unusual for him. He had spent hours blacking out an entire page with a black pen, except for the very center where he left a bright white spot with my name in it. I'm guessing I gave him one little piece of brightness in that terrible place. I still think of him with utter sadness, because that kid just didn't even stand a chance. He was trapped in the system, and I abandoned him. Story 61. Not disturbing, but pretty sad. I worked in a psych hospital during college. Since I did not have real qualifications, one of my jobs was to do art projects with the lower functioning patients, while the higher functioning patients went to group therapy. We had a well-stocked art room, so we had lots of choices for projects. One day, one of the patients suggested drawing pictures of their favorite vacation. One guy drew a very basic picture of a pine tree, like one a first grader would draw. At the end of the session, everyone had to say a little about what their picture represented. When it came to this guy's turn, he said, "I've never been on vacation. My parents go every year, and they stop giving me my medicine so they can put me in here while they go. If I ever go on vacation, I just want to sit under a tree and be happy." I didn't know whether to believe him, but I checked with some of the nurses and they confirmed it. Every summer, the guy gets committed around the same time, and his parents don't visit for a couple of weeks while they go on vacation. It was disturbing and sad on multiple levels. What kind of crappy parents would intentionally stop giving a guy his meds, prompting him to have a psychotic break and have him be hospitalized? Story 62. Not in art class or a teacher, but definitely related. In middle school, I was always doodling in my language arts notebook, and it was just after I got my hands on the lovely game of Modern Warfare 2. Me being in middle school, I didn't fully grasp the concept of school shootings, as there hadn't been one in a while that I had heard about. I began to draw my favorite mission in Modern Warfare 2. No Russian, because they didn't fight back. For those that don't know, No Russian is an infamous mission from the game where you play as an undercover American who poses as a terrorist to get closer to the antagonist Makarov. You essentially play as a terrorist and shoot everyone inside at the airport. I drew a small sketch of Makarov in the bottom left of the page, just him with a light machine gun, and left it at that for a while. I was kind of proud at how good he looked though, so I repopulated the page with pictures of my favorite weapons from the game. The EBR, the F-2000 were quickly added. Next thing you know, it looks like an armory with some Russian guy just shooting in the bottom left. No one knew, so I didn't really care, and I was secretly proud of the effort that went into it. Well, towards the end of the year, my language arts teacher was looking at homework, and I began flipping through the pages of my language arts book until she noticed the masterpiece. She kind of just stopped flipping and looked at it for what felt like an eternity, and I suddenly realized, maybe I shouldn't have done this in a school book. She just gave this grimace that had a slight hint of being impressed. I sat there quietly awaiting my fate, and she just looked at me and said, "Should I be concerned about this?" To which I quickly affirmed, I'm completely sane, and that it's just from a game. I never heard anything about it after that, but I may be on a watch list or two now. Shin, Debris, too long didn't read, drew No Russian and a bunch of guns from MW2. Teacher found it. Edit. I had a hard time when we modeled train cars for an engineering class, and we got to make up one cart of our own creation that had a certain criteria. I made mine a nuclear disposal cart inspired by D-Train and finished early. Some kid who was kind of behind said he wanted a sniper rifle mounted on his car, and I said I'd do it for him if he worked on the cart for it to be mounted. I made an okay intervention that my teacher quickly told me with a laugh to get rid of it. Story 63. I had a summer school kids class at the paint and sip studio where I worked. It was like 2 weeks for a few hours a day. There were two sisters, about 7 and 5, who absolutely loved to come. Paint and sip studios have an art instructor and assistant painfully walk a class of drunk housewives through an ugly butt painting. Everyone paints the same thing step by step. The kids' class was the same, except kids like to express their creativity and drink in moderation. Anyway, we were painting ducks and flowers with a cute bee, got to 5-year-olds painting, and there was 1 duck, 1 flower, and like 15 bees. I asked her if she really liked bees, and she told me no one likes bees. Her sister, who always painted exactly what was an example painting and never anything else, had said that 5-year-old's duck wasn't good, and 7-year-old was allergic to bees. 5-year-old was going to hang their paintings very close together in hopes that her bees might fly over and kill her sister's perfect ducks. I said that wasn't very nice, and 7-year-old might be sad, to which 5-year-old said, no, the bees would kill her too. Then she signed her name 5 inches high in the middle of the canvas, because that's who she is. Story 64. This was a sad illustrated story my friend dug out of her garage. Both of us had really abusive parents, but our parents hated each other and were like in a competition about who was less abusive. This is a story my friend wrote and drew together about the situation when we were 6. I was the horse and my friend was the fox. One day there was a fox and a horse, and they both had children. The mother fox and the mother horse were enemies. The mother fox told her baby, I think you are old enough for me to tell you who our enemies are. We have only 2 enemies. Number 1, hunters. Number 2, horses. They are crazy animals. They can kick hard and run fast. They are evil creatures. If I see you play with any of these things, then you cannot live with me anymore. And back at the horse's house, the mother was talking to her baby. Now I think you are old enough for me to tell you who your enemies are. There are 2 people in foxes. Foxes are ruthless evil that'll attack you, steal your food, and tear you to bits. If you play with them, you may not live with me anymore. My friend has a ridiculously good memory and says that when I wrote that page, she asked what ruthless meant, And I said, I don't know, but I know it's bad. I also like that I drew myself as Little Black Emo Pony. I still draw just about that well, but now I'm a published author, so I guess this was a good head start. I'm also still depressed as FOC, so I've got that going for me. Story 65. I was a painfully shy kid. Talking to people still makes me slightly nervous at 27. Introverts, yo. So I would draw how I was feeling. If I was mad at my mom, I would take a crayon and make jagged, angry scribbles. Then I would crumple it up with all of my 3-year-old anger and throw it at her. When I wasn't mad anymore, it was happy round loops and swirls delivered in a more peaceful manner. Well, as I got older and started drawing humanoid figures, that theme stayed, but got a little more disturbing. Mad Time Mom has pushed off a cliff onto spikes, and I am a giant dinosaur thing with spikes, and Mom is being digested into my stomach acid. Sometimes Mom pushed me off the cliff. People were on fire. Once my grandpa did something, and he was being struck dead by lightning. Happy times, smiles, hearts, and rainbows. My mom was fairly active in our classrooms when we were kids, and she thought my drawings were entertaining. She had told another parent about them, and that parent asked if maybe I needed to see a therapist, or if my mom had any concerns about me. Nope. Just a little weirdo. Still a little weirdo. Story 66. Admission interviews for a sculpture department in a very prestigious art school. Occasionally, a candidate will bring actual examples of their work rather than just looking at slides. It's very common for young women to do work with and about their own bodies. As a teacher, you get used to that pretty quickly. In this case, the student had done a silicone cast of her own underside, is the best way I can describe it. It's a perfect cast of her butt and everything else in a rubbery real doll feeling material. And so throughout her 20-minute interview, 15 people sitting around a large conference table passed this object from one to the next, rolling it over in their hands and inspecting it. The whole thing was more absurd than disturbing, completely out of the context of the way one would approach a work of art. What might have been an interesting piece just became this weird feeling that part of her interview was each professor getting a really good look at the most intimate parts of her very attractive body. If the discomfort in the room was part of her intention, it really wasn't clear. Based on her other work, I think it was a very effective piece. She wasn't accepted, so we never found out for sure. Story 67. Not me, but while I was a student teacher, we had a guest lecturer in class who told us about one of her students. This kid would draw a beautiful picture of his family, and then when he was done, he would take a red crayon and violently cross out his father. This concerned the administration, obviously. They investigated but didn't make any progress. All they could get out of him was that he loved his father and his father loved him. No abuse, no misconduct, no drugs or alcohol use, nothing. After speaking with the father, they finally figured it out. The father was taking nitroglycerin pills for his heart. The kid, having watched many cartoons where the characters ingested nitroglycerin, was afraid that his father was going to blow up. This fear manifested itself in his artwork. They settled the kid's nerves by setting up a meeting with the kid, his father, and his father's doctor to explain what the pills were and what they were for. Story 68. Not an art teacher, but last week my 6-year-old son came home from school with a 4-page booklet a girl in his class made him. Page 1 is a devious-looking face with the caption, "I hate priestess," which I think is supposed to be, "I hate priests," because they go to Catholic school. Could be she hates the priests, though. Page 2 is her killing a girl in her class with the girl's name under it to verify who it is, then at the same time dreaming of doing the same. Meanwhile, a named boy, not my son, is watching from a jail cell. Page 3 is rain clouds, a dead girl with her name on a gravestone, and then dad written really big. Maybe they both are in the same grave, or maybe her dad killed the girl. The same girl, by the way, is page 2. Page 4 is an angry face, angry eyebrows, and zigzag mouth. So that was pretty great. I called my son over to ask him about it. He said the girl had given it to him, and he hadn't read it yet. Asked him to look at it and tell me about it. He had a pretty big smile flipping through it and thought it was great because she's killing that girl. And also, he likes the angry face at the end a lot. So wonderful. That backfired. I still haven't decided if I'm going to ignore it or take it to the teacher or notify one or both groups of parents. Story 69. I'm not a teacher, but I did a pretty creepy project in high school and heard a lot of people worriedly talking about it in the halls. We were supposed to make clay sculptures that functioned as containers but weren't obviously containers. I decided to make a container shaped like a lady in a Victorian-style dress, complete with corset and giant skirt because I'm goth trash. The container parts separated where the corset and skirt met, and the lady was supposed to be all pretty and have nice hair. I didn't have the tools to make a hollow head like ceramic sculptures are supposed to have, so I just improvised and tried to make it work. The head ended up being way too heavy for the neck to support it, so after sculpting a blank face with a nose and eye cavities, I just said, F it, and severed the head from the neck instead of continuing to add detail that would only make it heavier. So now I had a decapitated lady waiting to be fired in the kiln. Once the firing was done, we were supposed to paint the sculptures with acrylics. Like I said, I'm goth trash, so I like gory and bloody stuff, horror, etc. And my sculpture having no head was pretty weird, so I decided to paint the exposed skin deathly pale and to add some blood dripping from the top of the neck. I even added a darker area in the middle, so when looking down at it from the top, it looked like the remains of a spine. I figured that seeing as she had no head, it would be good to make it look like she had actually been decapitated, instead of just giving her a headless neck for no visible reasons. I think my art teacher was a bit weirded out, but when I gave him the logical explanation, he figured it made enough sense even if it was a bit odd. Another time I drew a picture of a girl running through a graveyard with zombies coming out of the graves and stuff I can't draw. Hands, so I just sort of gave her a light outline of hands. I was having a really dumb week and couldn't be bothered to try harder at hands. You couldn't really see them with all the stuff that was going on in the background of the picture, so most people in my class thought she didn't have hands at all. For the whole critique period, the class was trying to figure out what kind of statement I was making by not giving her hands. All the while I'm sitting there thinking, she has hands, I just got lazy. Can we please move on to the next person? This is my worst work. Another time we did abstract sculptures and mine was supposed to be a mermaid tail coming out of the ocean. According to my friends, it looked like one of those Japanese dildos that aren't supposed to look like chickens. Time I learned my projects always come out really weird. Story 70. Not an art teacher, but during my time as a teaching assistant, while getting my license, I was working with 7th grade inclusion classes. Inclusion is when they take the special needs kids and the gifted kids sprinkle in the average kids and hope they all kind of work together. Anyways, the first day of class, we had them draw their life path, where they do a step-by-step drawing of what they've done until now. It was a get-to-know-your activity. As 7th graders got a lot of basic stuff. Brother, sister was born, we moved, we went to the Disney World, etc. But 2 drawings come to mind. The first was from your average tough guy kid, the one who wears black jackets and are too cool for school. Well, the first step in his life path was a drawing of a man stabbing a baby in cartoonish stock figure fashion. And under it was written, "My dad kills my brother." No. Well, I have never dealt with this before, so I was a bit shocked to say the least. So I brought it to my lead teacher who spoke with him. Turns out when this kid was young, his father abducted him and his brother for several years, which culminated in the father killing the baby brother. The father now has life. Pretty terrifying reality for this kid. He later got suspended for misbehavior, and I didn't see him for the rest of my time as a teaching assistant. The next was this big kid. Looked like he was in high school, but was definitely 12. This kid had troubles learning, but it didn't seem to be a major disability. He also rapped most of the answers to my questions, right or wrong. Though his rapping was rather quiet, almost mumbled, so it wasn't very good. But I played along since it was the only way he participated. Anyway, this kid didn't make a life path as asked, but instead made a long poem about the Bloods and the Crips and how the gangbang evolved. As a tidbit, it went something like this. There was once some gangbangers called the Crips. There was gangbanging like none before. But then some other gangbangers came again, called the Bloods, who was gangbanging hard. Paraphrasing, of course, but it was definitely interesting. Anyways, the kid was fine in class, but near the end of my stint, he got jumped and shanked in the lunch pavilion. Remember, 7th and 8th graders only at this school, because he wanted to be in a rival gang, wasn't even in one yet, despite his attitude. He was alive, but he wasn't at school till after I left. Story 71. In college, I had a photography class with a teacher who was a drunk. She would show up tipsy with no idea for an assignment and wax poetic about images until she stumbled into an idea. Then she would assign it to the class. One week she rambles on and I'm sick of her drunk and bullcrap, So when she finally spits out that this week's 12-pick topic is the secret passage, I got so mad I'd go home to the girlfriend and hatch a plan. I photograph her from my POV extremely up close and use a lot of blur and shots of my hand slapping and clocking her. 11 pics of her being slapped around in extreme close-up, then Nutbringer 12 shows her looking at herself in a mirror with an impressive amount of makeup FX for bruising. It was definitely convincing. I gave my presentation the next week, and as each image comes up, I'm describing a relationship that this fictitious woman has where her husband ignores her every night until he gets drunk and eventually beats her. And the last pic of her smiling is her finally happy, because the journey of being beaten is how she gets his attention every night. But she can't tell anyone that because it's her secret passage to his love for her. The teacher's face became more and more horrified as I went on. She eventually tried to stop my presentation. I refused and just talked over her until I was done. Afterwards, her and I had to talk about her trying to stop me and how I wasn't going to allow anyone to hold me back from my work. Turned out that her last husband was still in jail for abusing her years before. She had a little cry, we hugged, and I apologized. I got an A on the project, and she hired me to head a 2-week photo project. All expenses paid to Banff, Canada. I was 30 in college, she was 49. Story 72. Not a teacher, but from a student's perspective. In high school, I had a very hippie-ish, be-your-own-person type of teacher. She gave us this big speech against censorship and how she would never censor us as long as the work was technically sound. She said, "My class is more about the development of technique than content, so don't be afraid to be yourselves and express yourself. If you think something might be offensive to others, talk to me, and we will arrange a private corner of the room for you to work and only share your work with me." I finally got excited at this prospect. I was in my weird teenage years, and I had this strange attraction to taboo topics. I remember the inside of the Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction album had a scene that looked like a woman had just been essayed by a robotic character. The shock of it was kind of appealing to me for some reason. I figured this teacher is really going to appreciate if I test the boundaries. So I resolved to create the most epic artwork I'd ever done, and I wanted to invoke some sort of emotion. Fear, anger, sympathy, happiness, grief, whatever. But I wanted that emotion to be strong. At the time, Marilyn Manson was pretty popular, and he shocked people with cross-dressing, Nazi imagery, etc. And while I wasn't particularly a fan of his, I appreciated that aspect of what he did. Maybe it was the teenage attention wherein maybe I was just finding myself. I don't know. So after much deliberation, I decided that the strongest, most impressionable topic I could think of was racism. But I wanted it to look professional and well done, which isn't easy to do. At first, I decided to make a KKK recruitment poster that would look professionally done, as if the KKK had launched a high-dollar nationwide campaign, and I wanted it to have a corporate vibe, as if it was accepted by the public. Similar to an Uncle Sam I Want You poster. I didn't want it to have a "this is to offend minorities" vibe to it. I wanted it to not address racism and just appear as if the Klan was going about daily business. So I chose black paper and used colored pencils to create a very detailed close-up of a hooded Klansman giving a thumbs up. This was me pushing myself because I was really bad at making realistic hands. And also working on black paper with colored pencils was difficult because it's hard to sketch out things ahead of time and you can't erase. So it had to be perfect right out of the gate. I drew it more difficult sections on white paper with pencil to get it right first at practice, then recreated it on the piece itself. I spent 2 weeks working on this poster, and I was really proud of the shading on all of the cloth on the Klansman's outfit. I made sure that the border was perfectly symmetrical and perfectly aligned. By the time I was done with it, I had almost completely forgotten about the shock factor. It was a piece of art. It was the best thing I had ever created to date. I was very proud of it and I loved it. I would even have quick fantasies about me becoming a famous artist, and this piece being on display as an example of how technically sound and provocative I was. There would be a narrative about how the poster represented how society overlooked racism and just accepted it as a normal element that one would simply choose to be a part of or not, as if it were a club. I wanted to get my teacher's input and see if there was any finishing touches I could put on it before I Mod Podged it. I took it up to her desk and this peaceful hippie immediately turned into the spawn of Satan. She started ripping it up into smaller and smaller pieces, as if she didn't want anyone to see any part of it. While she was ripping, she said, "I will not have my supplies wasted on garbage like this. Go to the office. You are not welcome in this classroom." I tried to explain my motivation behind the piece, but she interrupted me with, "Go." Her face was so red I thought she was going to punch me in the face, so I left. By the time I got to the office, they had already apparently heard about my art piece, or at least heard a description of it. I told them about her anti-censorship piece and how I wanted to make something emotive. They were calm but not sympathetic at all. I got a 3-day suspension and kicked out of that class. At first, I felt really bad. Maybe I pushed it too far. I didn't want to offend her. I thought she was open-minded. So I went to her classroom after school to apologize and hopefully explain myself. But all I got to was, "Hey, Miss Chandler, I just wanted to apologize. I didn't mean to." She cut me off and said, "Apology accepted. Please leave my room." "Okay. I just wanted to let you know you shouldn't be here. Please leave." As I got into the hallway, I heard her calling the office to report that I was there. So I decided to get out in front of it and go straight to the office. This was after school, so I didn't have to. I told the principal, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know that I tried to apologize to Ms. Chandler, and she didn't respond very well. I just wanted to let you know, in case she mentions it, I genuinely didn't mean to offend her." He basically told me that she had requested that I not go near her and just leave her alone. He had kind of a tone that hinted that even he thought she was being overdramatic. After that episode, my opinion morphed from guilt to F her. She is being completely unreasonable. I did exactly what she asked us to do. Now I have to sit in the study hall instead of my favorite class. That was like 22 years ago, and I'm guessing that if she were in this thread, she would say that my effed up KKK recruitment poster was one of her WTF projects. It seemed to shake her to the core. Story 73. So my kid was in 4th grade. This must be 2002 or so. This is the first week of school. I am at work and I get a call from the school telling me that they had my son in the office, and I needed to get up there and speak with the police. I think WTF drop everything and head up there. He is sitting there terrified and crying with 2 cops, the school counselor and the principal looming over him. I ask what happened, and they hand me a picture he drew. It was a stick figure drawing of a bunch of kids running around a few crude explosions, and several of the kids were holding what looked like dynamite with lit fuses. I asked what this was about, and they went on about how they were interpreting this as a threat against the school. I asked my son what was going on, and he said, "I just did what they asked me to do." As I start asking questions, I find out that they wanted the kids to draw a picture about what they did over the summer. It was a pretty uneventful summer, other than we had a 4th of July picnic at the lake that was sort of an unofficial family reunion. There were a lot of people there, fireworks, food, swimming, stuff like that. He said those were just fireworks and started explaining how some of his cousins would light a black cat and toss it at some of the kids, and they would run away laughing and screaming. You know, like kids will do. I confirmed this was actually what happened, and he just completed the assignment as requested. They said that, unfortunately, they had zero tolerance for stuff like this, and that they had to pursue it. They wound up sending them to the district's alternative school. The problem is, they didn't have accommodations for kids that young, so they tossed them in the class with all the high schoolers. They absolutely locked us into agreeing with this. They said if we decided to pull them out of school over it, they would let the police take care of it. We weren't making enough to afford a lawyer, and we were honestly afraid that if we pulled him out of school, the cops would show up and arrest him. They had a no bullcrap policy at the alternative center. If a kid was caught breaking a rule, they would add time. One of those rules was complete silence. It doesn't take much for a high school thug to make a 10-year-old kid holler. His 6 weeks stretched into 9 weeks, then 12 weeks, etc. We finally got him out there during the Christmas break. He still had a rough time with it after that, but all the kids thought he was a psycho. I effing hate government schools and bureaucratically mandated dismissal of common sense and judgment. Story 74 drew a picture, freaked out the entire school office, caused 2 fresh out of college teachers to quit altogether. Not a teacher, but I was one of those kids. Actually, I was an accomplice to one of those kids. It happened in the year my parents had their custody battle over my brothers and I. I was in 7th grade. We had 2 teachers teaching our English class. They both were young, fresh out of college, and dealing with the most ill-behaved class they'd ever seen. These two were frustrated on the best of days and screaming at us on the worst. One day we were given a pop quiz, and before the quiz starts, the teachers were yelling at most of us to shut up and sit down. I hated that class. I was very frustrated with the teachers, and I was going to make them very aware of that. After I finished my test, I flipped it over and began drawing The Classroom from Hell. Seriously, that was the title. I put it on the back of a test. Man, I was a stupid kid. The drawing was a bunch of stick figure students with frowny faces sitting in desks surrounded by flames. The two teachers were standing up front, yelling at the students with really mean looks on their stupid stick figure faces. Near the end of the class, we were told to pass the papers forward. The student in front of me snatched my paper, saw the picture, and began adding his own little additions to the drawing. But he wouldn't show me what it was. Fast forward 2 hours, and I got called down to the school resource office. APD, who pretty much babysits the school, who then begins to question me, asking me if I did anything wrong and what I did today, the works. I told them I had no idea. I walked into the principal's office and I see my mom with a very angry look on her face. I still had no idea what I had done wrong. Angry parents, a police officer, and both principals had my attention. I saw them open a folder and lay out a copy of my drawing. The addition was pretty clear now. My heart sank when I looked down and saw the student in front of me drew 2 guns with little round bullets pointed toward the stick figures teachers with our teachers' names above them. I was beyond enraged. I fought and fought as my fate was held above me. The seriousness of this incident meant 5 days out of school suspension, pending expulsion, plus the possibility of terroristic threatening charges. As I looked at the drawing, I was asked if I drew the picture. I said I had, but not the guns. I had to explain about the student in front of me. My brothers were brought into the school office and asked if that was my drawing. They both said it was my style of drawing. Everyone looked like my style except for the guns and the names. The officer got intense with the questions, and I reiterated that I did not draw the guns. I was still suspended for the drawing itself, but was cleared of the guns. I was quite proud of the drawing before the guns and names. And looking at my actions from those years, I think I was a very alarming kid. My books had my name with the AKA Demon Child after it. I was a fat little bully. I was bullied myself, and I just kept the chain going. I was always talking back and yelling and acted out all of the time. The odds were against me then and at my other middle school in my senior year. Stupid mistakes are okay. They happen. Stupid mistakes at the wrong time in the wrong place can mess you up big time. Those 2 teachers quit that year. Rumor was that I really freaked them out, even though it wasn't completely me. I was kicked out at the end of the year because I was school choiced. Story 75. So when I was a kid growing up, we butchered our own animals and had all of the extended family over to do their own. It was always a fun experience, everyone getting together, making sausage patties and steaks or whatever else we decided to make. In art class once, maybe junior high, we were asked to paint pictures of our favorite thing to do. Butchering animals together as a family, making sausage, eating, and hanging out was always pretty fun. We were usually allied to run around and do whatever. Of course, I figured drawing me shooting a pig would be a good representation to that, because that was the start of butchering. Little did I know how mortifying this picture looked to everyone else, especially when everyone's pictures got hung in the common area. I got an idea that it didn't look so good when one of my sisters came home and said, "Hey, that picture you painted is pretty dark." I realized we didn't have any explanations of the pictures, just our names on them at the bottom. I'm pretty sure everyone older than me and in my class thought I was slightly insane. I still didn't see the problem until I was older. I didn't go back and think, "Oh, this looks bad." But it was pretty normal for me growing up making as much of our own food as you could, canning meat and vegetables from our massive garden every year. Story 76. I know it isn't art, but I still think it's pretty relevant here. Creative writing classes, especially intro classes, tend to bring out a lot of dark emotions and memories in people. In 3 separate fiction classes, I've read 3 separate stories written by young women who had very clearly been essayed or abused. Every one of these stories ended with the protagonist killing the essayer. It's a pretty heartbreaking thing when you realize a few pages into a story that, 1, this probably happened, and 2, the young woman who wrote it was the victim. But the craziest thing I read was in my intro to creative writing class. The first half of the semester was dedicated to writing poetry, and the second half was for writing fiction. The first guy to turn in work for the poetry portion was this stocky, slightly dopey dude who I recognized from a local restaurant where he was a cook. During the first couple of classes, he and I chatted a bit, and he seemed pretty nice. Then he turned in his 5 poems. Every one of them read something like this. I know you and your wife talk about me behind my back. I know what you say about me, and I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to slam you against the refrigerator and hold my fillet knife to your throat. I'm going to make your wife watch as you beg for your life, but it won't work. I'm going to kill you and bleed you like a pig. Then I'll make her watch while I beat your dead body. The bugs will eat you and what's left of your stinking corpse. Then I will put a claw hammer on your wife. You did this to yourself, you effing piece of crap. Let's see how pretty your hair and face is with dried blood. No one will cry for you, not even the bugs. We attempted to workshop his poems, but he just got up and walked out in the middle of it. He never came back, and I never saw him at the restaurant again. I know it was a creative writing class, but what's the line between admiring the art and calling the cops 380? Not a teacher, but here are my group of friends. One is now a tattoo artist, but in high school he always did weird stuff, like painted a ceiling tile for a classroom with a crazy cross-eyed farmer milking a bull, and the bull looked very happy. It was up for at least 2 years after he painted it. Then there was the skydiver without a parachute, who was falling so fast his skin and muscle was ripping off. There are so many I can't even begin to list. He is an amazing artist with a vivid imagination. 2 made every project his junior year about poop. I mean, every single one was poop-related. So senior year, he was told not to make any more poop-related art. He did until the final project, which had a poop farm where everything was poop. The crops, the house, the farmer's clothes, the tractor, and barn, everything was poop. 3 then, there was me who asked our brand new first teaching job, every art teacher, out for dining on day 1. She was so freaked out that she had a hard time talking to me or looking me in the eyes until I graduated, and a vent for some time afterwards. I'm sorry, Miss Coffee, I was being funny, and had been planning to do so the whole summer before school started. Story 77. I'm not a teacher or an aide, but I was going to class in a K-5 school. We were there to talk about our business and encourage kids to understand how important school was. Anyway, as my 2 other co-workers were making their little presentation to a 3rd grade class, I sat at the teacher's desk casually glazing over what was on it. Most of it was on the desk and artwork that the kids had made to describe their families, and most of it was the usual parents and siblings all smiling kind of thing. One, however, was made into a photocopy and written on, from what I assume was probably an aide. It was the picture of a boy, a baby with X's for eyes, and an angry mom, and that's all. I vaguely remember exactly what the text wrote, but it was an aide asking why he drew this, and him saying something along the lines that his mom was angry at him because he hurt his brother. I'm going to make an assumption that his mother had a stillbirth, or maybe the infant had passed away from other complications, and the boy didn't understand, so he thought his mother was mad at him about it. I say this only because I've sat in with the psychiatrist before that and tried to help ease a little girl whose brother passed away before birth and helped her to understand what was happening and that her parents weren't mad, but instead were trying to grieve. Though that's just one big assumption. Story 78. Not an art teacher, but I do remember something in grade school once around 4th grade, I think. A friend of mine who went on to be my best friend all the way through grade school, and I'm still friends with today, who at the time was very interested in World War II. Everything from tanks to battles to leaders, etc. We considered him to be the smartest kid in class for a while. Anyway, we were in art class, and we were making gingerbread men out of Play-Doh or something, so it must have been near the holidays. So my friend, let's call him Mike, fresh off his World War II kick, took his little plastic knife, and instead of drawing a smiley face on the head, like he was supposed to, he carved a swastika into the gingerbread man's head in glorious style. So once the teacher comes around, sees Hans Landa, the gingerbread man, he is visibly upset. He rages and screams at us, shows us pictures of concentration camp survivors, and tells us all about Anne Frank. At FB 9 years old, although Mike had to go counseling for a month and may have been suspended, though I don't remember for sure that teacher upset us as much as Mike upset him, so that teacher didn't last long. Story 79. Not a teacher. When my sister and I were little, we were always drawing. Our parents really encouraged it, probably because it kept us occupied and for the creativity. My mom never got along with her brother. I learned as I got older that he's a manipulative tyrant. Anyway, we'd hear our mom complain to our dad about how her brother was mistreating and taking advantage of their elderly parents. When our grandfather died, we'd hear our grandmother tell my mom how unhappy she was living with our uncle. My sister and I used to draw our uncle inside ovens, with all his blood cells pouring out. They looked like lifesaver candies. We learned what blood cells look like from the magic school bus. It was a drawing we do all the time. Uncle Bob in the oven. We had piles of these. We thought they were hilarious. Our mom used to tell us to stop, but it was our favorite thing to draw, just so no one wonders why our mom didn't go get her. Long story, but our grandparents were originally supposed to live with us in the Bay Area, but opted out because they thought they would be independent again. They chose to live with our uncle since he lived close to their town in SoCal. By the time our grandfather passed, our dad became terminally ill, and my mom couldn't take care of her mom, 2 little kids, and a dying husband. Story 80. I'm not an art teacher, but I went to a K-12 school, and my 6th grade teacher was moved to teaching 1st grade, and in high school I was his TA and spent a lot of time in his classroom. They were a pair of twins who were bright, hilarious, played hockey. I babysat them when they were older. Had a sound home life from what I could tell. Listened in class, etc. But I entertained the kids a lot by drawing cartoons of them, so they and other children would draw with me. And it was also part of being in 1st grade to just draw things. They both had names that started with B, and when they were younger, their parents dressed them the same a lot. I don't know if one of them really resented this, but he'd always draw pictures of his brother locked in a cage with him saying things like, "I'm hungry," and him laughing with pizza in his hand, and other forms of him either killing or torturing his brother. One was standing on his grave. He had flowers though, I think. The other brother just laughed at it. Once he drew his teacher drowning and saying help, and him just standing on the shoreline smiling. He also drew something I couldn't really make sense of, and when I asked him to explain it, figure, with a Hannibal Lecter mask, and then obviously him, with him holding ropes that extended to the other figure. "Oh, that's just my brother. I gave him a mask so I wouldn't have to hear him scream. And what are those for?" I pointed to the ropes. "To shock him with the lightning." I kept some of these. Sometime I turned into his teacher because, since it always puzzled me how they clashed with his personality, and he kind of stopped doing it. I never found any drawings when they were a few years older, and they were always together and got along fine in real life. Or so I thought. I don't know. They're at my mom's house, but I might have uploaded one to a really old photo bucket. Now I want to try and find it. Story 81. When I was in art college, we had to draw nude models. Most always it was nude women, but this specific day we had a black male. One girl in class threw a fit to our instructor, telling her that she refused to draw the man's chicken. She ended up drawing the whole model, but left a blank spot on the paper where his junk was supposed to be. We all went to break, and when we returned, she let out a scream, shoved all her tools and drawing paper into the air, and ran out of class. I was sitting nearby and picked up her paper, instantly laughed my butt off, and held up her paper to the class, which someone had sneakily drew a giant chicken down to his ankles on her paper. Class thought it was hilarious, but our instructor gave us a short speech on respecting others' property. The instructor said whoever did it should go out in the hallway and look at me straight in the eyes and go apologize to her. I laughed and said it wasn't me. At the end of the year when we graduated, her best friend came up to me and told me she had drawn that giant chicken. We laughed, and I've never seen any of them since.